What can House Elves teach us about slavery? You'll find out right after this. Hey everybody, I am Taylor from Beard vs. Geek, where I show you it is okay to be a man and a geek at the same time. Today we are back in the realm of Harry Potter, and we're talking about House Elves. Now, House Elves were introduced to us in the second book of the series, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, in the form of Dobby, who has his own issues, but is a house elf to the Malfoy family. Now, it is later found out through the other Harry Potter books that there are thousands of house elves living in Britain, all of which are enslaved by wizards. However, as Ron stated, they like being enslaved. They like doing work for wizards. And that seems to be a very common trope in the Harry Potter series. Everyone except for Hermione Granger, who started the Spew campaign. Now, this justification and this claim that house elves like their work, it's kind of true, it's mostly false. See, house elves are a very thinly veiled allegory for human enslavement. And since we're dealing with J.K. Rowling, who is British, let's talk mostly about British slavery. One aspect of that was claiming over and over again that slaves enjoy being enslaved. Pro-slavery people and anti-abolitionist people, that is, people who did not want to abolish the slave trade or slavery, used images like these in order to promote the fact, or promote the mistaken belief, that slaves were actually quite happy and, in fact, very intent, which, is kind of messed up. In fact, this argument that slaves are happy being enslaved was even debated in Parliament multiple times. The claim was very simple and was brought up in February of 1805 when Mr. Huddleston was talking about it in the House of Commons. The argument is, quote, "You are mistaken." He's now quoting somebody else. "You are mistaken. The slaves are, in fact, very happy. Much happier than the laboring poor in England. But what do they have to be happy about when they're constantly mistreated, like Dobby in Harry Potter, who is always forced to iron his hands or stick his ears in the oven, or is just plain kicked around and beat up by the Malfoys? So what about conditions on the plantations? Well, pro-slavery people actually sent people to different plantations in the West Indies, now called the Caribbean, in order to find out the conditions that the slaves were living in order to help justify their arguments. And so, accordingly, they probably went to the plantations that took the best care of their slaves. And so Mr. Barham said in 1807, in the relation to how slaves are treated on the plantations, he said this, quote, that the total time of labor was only 10 hours. The whip of the driver was never used, though it was formerly, and it was no more used now than the mace was to knock down members in the lobby, referring to the lobby of the House of Parliament and the mace that the guards would use. That, well, it was issued to them, but they never really used it. That was his whole point. The whole argument that house elves are happy being enslaved, that their living conditions are actually quite good, is extremely similar to the pro-slavery argument that existed not only in Britain, but in a lot of the Western world, including right here in the United States. However, things were a lot different in real life, such as we found out in Harry Potter. In Harry Potter, we found out that the house elves are actually enslaved, that the living conditions vary depending on the masters. For example, the life of Kreacher is a lot different than Dobby, and Dobby's life with the Malfoys was far different than the house elves taking place and hanging out in Hogwarts. You see, a lot of the living conditions and how they're treated depended on who owned them. Some people were very generous to them and who treated them very well, so the house elves were more happy or more dedicated to that master. However, when they were mistreated and to the point of just outright all sorts of abuse, like Dobby, living conditions are far from idyllic. Of course, they're all enslaved, so that's a far from idyllic life anyway. To put it into human terms, this is what really happened. On a lot of plantations all over the New World, slaves were often beaten and tortured in extremely inhumane manners. These images right here are actual photographs of former slaves who, those are scars all over their backs from whips. It's outright inhuman. Now there's also parallels with House Elves in ironing of their hands and in performing all of these different tortures and punishments to the House Elves for disobeying orders. So obviously House Elves are a very thin allegory for real life slavery. So what becomes of it? Well, Hermione starts Spew, which while she's at school does absolutely nothing except supply Dobby with a bunch of hats and pisses off a bunch of house elves in the kitchens. Because you see, similar to a lot of slaves in real life, they were so indoctrinated with their living conditions, they were so indoctrinated with their masters, that a lot of them didn't really realize how bad it was to be a slave, because relative to a bunch of other slaves, they were treated rather fairly in the relative side of things. So, like the House Elves in Hogwarts, they didn't want to hear anything about receiving clothes and becoming free, because they rather liked their masters, they performed good jobs, and they had a fairly easy life for a house elf. Well, that was true for a lot of slaves in the real world. They rather liked their masters, they rather liked their work, and so they thought life isn't so bad. So they didn't really care about abolition because they didn't see too many downsides. However, that was the minority. In fact, on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, the mortality rate was extremely high. So much so that there were debates even in Parliament about how many slaves to ship to fill the population void that kept diminishing with sugar plantations, just so Europe can have its sugar in its tea. Although that side of things is not fully grasped in Harry Potter, where we don't have huge amounts of house elves dying during the books, we do know that it did occur. While Lord Voldemort, or he who must not be named, was in power, we found out that house elves were dying all over the place and were extremely mistreated and just outright not cared for. So now that all that stuff has been firmly established, what did we learn from J.K. Rowling as far as actually like freeing house elves and slavery and all sorts of other things? Well, if it wasn't for the Harry Potter fan base that's out there, Spew would have done absolutely nothing and jack squat and would not have increased or helped out the house elves at all. Now, though, that we have Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and J.K. Rowling keeps coming out with new tweets and everything, answering people's questions, we find out that yes, Spew did make a bit of a difference, but it did not outright free house elves, at least not to my knowledge. Which, I have to say, is freaking horrible to J.K. Rowling. You want to make it perfectly clear when you bring up a social issue of such immensity, such as slavery, starting in your second book and carry it on through your seventh book, you want something like that to get resolved. Okay, I know we're dealing with the Dark Lord here, and you're trying to worry about Voldemort taking over the world, and the whole analogy with Nazism and racism and classism and all the other stuff. But slavery, that seems like an issue that you want to affirm. Yes, it ended at X point within the books. Now, unlike in the Harry Potter books, we know for a fact that slavery was abolished and that the slave trade even today is being actively fought against. And slaves were given equal rights to everyone else. Although securing those rights, especially in America, actually a century of civil rights fighting and protests trying to secure those rights for African Americans. So it was a long, and it still is, a long, grueling struggle for true equality. I want to know what you guys think about this analogy with house elves and slavery, and why it wasn't resolved to the satisfaction of actually telling people, oh my goodness, this is bad and it needs to be opposed. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about this whole issue. If you like this video, subscribe. Great videos like this are coming out every week where I show you it is okay to be a man and a geek at the same time. You can check out these two videos right here for some awesome stuff that I'm sure you're going to like. And remember, if the women don't find you manly, they should at least find you geeky. And until next time, don't go shaving on me.